Hello and welcome to the Scatterable channel, and today I'd like to introduce you guys to your next all-in-one $1,000 gaming PC designed for competitive high frame rate FPS gaming, graphically rich 2K resolution gaming, lag-free Twitch streaming, and even immersive virtual reality, all in an easy format that anyone can follow and build for themselves. So in today's build guide, I'm going to be covering, of course, the PC parts and how to install them inside the PC. And then I'll go ahead and show you guys what to do right after that when you finish building the PC when it comes to installing the drivers and any programs you might want to consider. And then we'll get into the fun part of the video where we'll get into the benchmarks for gaming and streaming. And then we'll finish off with my overall conclusions on my latest $1,000 PC build guide. And if you like PC build guide videos, like my upcoming streaming PC build guide, which will be releasing soon, where I'll be covering a dedicated streaming and gaming PC with no compromises, then don't subscribe to the Scatterable channel and don't like this video, because we've already got enough subscribers and I think this video will get enough likes already. So yeah, so let's get right into the build guide. And I just want to quickly mention that all the parts mentioned throughout this video will be linked in the description below. Quick disclaimer number one, if any of the parts in this video run out of stock or get really marked overpriced, then it's just up to you to find alternatives that will work just as well, which, to be frank with you, is not that hard to do. I will be explaining resources throughout this video to find alternatives that will give you similar quality and performance. And in the end, I mean, you can kind of just assume that most PC parts are meant to work together, especially when it comes to really general stuff like memory, power supplies, cases, etc. The only compatibility you really need to worry about in a PC like this is just making sure the processor fits in the motherboard. And secondly, I was sent the processor, motherboard, and graphics card for this PC build video, but everything else has been purchased with my own money for this build guide. And now with all that said, let's get into the parts and how to install them. Do that, but from my personal experience, my own studio is located on carpet and I've built many. So I'm actually gonna start with the motherboard because I'll explain my processor choice later on. I've chosen the MSI B550M Mortar Micro ATX motherboard. Now, in my opinion, this is the smartest choice for an upcoming motherboard in a Ryzen build if you want to stay up to date with the upcoming 4th generation of Ryzen processors, since these motherboards have the best chance of updating to those processors if you decide to do that. But if you don't, still, this motherboard is going to give you pretty much everything you'd want in a basic motherboard. For you normies, it has plenty of USB ports both on the back and on the top of the motherboard for your case I/O, as well as USB 3.1, and it has plenty of RGB ports on the actual motherboard itself, which you can control through MSI's Mystic Light RGB software, which is how you're able to see all these different colors on the PC case, the fans, and the Ryzen CPU cooler. And for you nerds, since this is a B550 motherboard, it does have higher quality VRMs, so the overall board itself will stay cooler even if you throw in like a 12 core or 16 core Ryzen processor and decide to overclock it. So again, I think this is a really smart and future-proof option for especially a high-end PC build like this. And now if you want to install the motherboard into a PC case like this, it's really easy to do. All you just got to make sure is that the standoffs inside the PC case line up with the motherboard. So just take your motherboard, line it up with the interior of the PC case, make sure you have all the standoffs inside the PC case that match up with the holes on the motherboard. If they don't, you can just unscrew them in the case and move them into the right spots. And once you have all the holes covered up with the right standoffs, slowly put in the motherboard, hook it up where the I/O usually goes on the back of the case, and then start screwing it in with those thin screws. And that's basically it, really, for installing the motherboard. And if this specific motherboard runs out of stock, you can use any other B550 motherboard, since for the most part, brand doesn't affect the overall motherboard compatibility with build guides like these. The brand doesn't change anything, just make sure that it's the B550 chipset and that it's Micro ATX or bigger. And now with my motherboard choice out of the way, I can get into the processor choice, which I'm going with the Ryzen 3 3300X, and this may be a little bit of a surprise to a lot of you guys watching this video. For a pure gaming CPU, the 3300X from I found matched or either exceeded its older 3600 brother, just because this processor here has a lower CCX latency and a higher clock speed. And despite that, I even found that the 3300X's rendering performance when compared to the 3600 was not too far behind on like your basic gaming montage clip that you'd edit in Adobe Premiere Pro or Sony Vegas. So I think a lot of people are undervaluing the 3300X's gaming performance as well as overall usability, since it's a quad-core processor, but it is hyper-threaded. So in my opinion, I think it's the biggest sleeper CPU on the market that a lot of people are overshadowing. And in truth as well, that 3300X can handle some pretty beefy graphics cards and still not encounter any sort of bottlenecking. So I think it's a really impressive processor for 120 bucks. Anyways, to install this processor into the motherboard, go ahead and find the little dot that is on the bottom left of the processor and line it up with the top left of the socket of the motherboard. You should see like a little triangle on the top left, and that's where you want to place that little yellow dot that's on the processor. So go ahead and open up the latch, put in your processor, wiggle it a little bit, make sure it's all the way in the socket, and then close the latch, and then you should have the Ryzen logo being parallel to the little black bar that is right next to the chip. And if the 3300X is out of stock, you can use any other 3rd gen Ryzen processor and it will be compatible with the motherboard. Now for the RAM, I've chosen 16 gigabytes of 3600 megahertz CAS latency 16 memory. Now the reason why I'm going with this is because since we're going with a 3rd gen Ryzen processor over a 2nd or 1st gen, we can use faster memory speeds that are out of the box with its built-in XMP profile to get you more frames per second in game. And that's why I've gone with this 3600 megahertz kicked from Patriot. It doesn't have to specifically be from Patriot. It can be from any other brand manufacturer. I would just make sure that it's 3600 megahertz or slower. Anyways, to install this RAM, go ahead and take it, put it where the RAM slots are on your motherboard. Make sure it lines up in a certain way because it'll only go in one direction. Make sure the tabs are open. Place in the RAM, and then once you put it in all the way, you should hear a little audible click. That means the tabs have gone in place and your RAM is in. And make sure you install both of these on the 2nd and 4th channel. And now for the storage, I've chosen a single 500 gigabyte Crucial MX500 M.2 SSD. Now I think this is a really great bang for buck M.2 SSD that is going to get you those lightning fast boot times for this PC, as well as pretty fast read and write speeds if you're installing a really big game onto this M.2 drive. And I think 500 gigabytes is still an acceptable size for a gaming PC like this, unless you're installing Call of Duty Warzone, because that game will take up 252 gigabytes, which in my opinion is way too much, which I honestly discount. So I still think 500 gigs is enough, just excluding that game. But for you M.2 SSD nerds, this MX500 has DRAM cache and it has the SM2258 controller, which from what I've heard is actually pretty good. So all of that for $70, I think makes a really great 500 gigabyte M.2 SSD, which is super easy to install in this PC. So to install it, make sure you unscrew the M.2 SSD heatsink on the motherboard and then remove the adhesive from the bottom of that. Then take your MX500, place it inside where that little slot is where the M.2 SSD goes, make sure it clicks in, and then press it down, put on top the M.2 heatsink, and then screw it back in, and you are done. You don't need any sort of hard drive or SATA SSD. That is going to be your whole storage and main boot drive for this PC. And remember, if you need more storage, you can add on more with a used or new hard drive, used or new SSD, whatever floats your boat. And now for the graphics card, I'm going with Team Green with the RTX 2060 Super, which this can be about $400, and the exact model does not matter. It just has to be a 2060 Super, or even if you wanted to go Team Red, the 5700 XT or 5700 is another good option. But there's a reason why I chose the 2060 Super for this build. Not only will this be the gaming workhorse behind getting those really great 1080p and 1440p gaming experiences, but it also has the NVIDIA NVENC encoder, which will allow us to get that lag-free and really crisp Twitch streaming quality that we want without using our processor. Because for the moment, using GPU encoding on NVENC actually produces better streaming results than using the CPU with an X264 software encoder. So if you want to do Twitch streaming, you're going to want to use this, which is why I'm using it for this build. But if you don't care about streaming, I would look into a Team Red alternative. Like I said, the 5700 XT is another great option, and it is going to be faster than this. To install the graphics card, go ahead and take out the two PCI brackets that are already on the case that are going to be populated by that graphics card. You can either unscrew them or physically break them off depending on the case. And then go ahead and take your graphics card, slide it into the topmost PCI Express slot, and once you put it in all the way, you should hear a little audible click, and you should see this little tab flip up, and that means the graphics card has locked into place. And then go ahead and take two thick screws and screw them in where they are on the bracket side of the graphics card so it won't limp down into the motherboard or the case and potentially fall off. And then put back on the bracket and you should be basically good to go. Now for the power supply, I want you to choose any 600 watt or greater power supply that is 80 plus bronze or better. Some examples are like the EVGA 600BQ, the MasterWatt 650, the Thermaltake BX1 650. You get the idea. Just choose a high quality 600 watt or above 80 plus bronze power supply. And if you're looking for a full list of those, I have a link in the description below showing you a PSU tier list on Linus Tech Tips forums, showing you guys a bunch of power supplies to buy and not to buy, which in this build guide, I would advise you stick to tier B or above. So to install the actual power supply, it's really easy. You just go ahead, take it, you slide it into the bottom of the PC case with the fan side down, and then you take 4 thick screws and screw them into the backside of the PC case. And for this build in specific, all you need to power on is the graphics card, motherboard, and CPU power connectors on the motherboard and graphics card, because we're working with an M.2 SSD, so we don't need any sort of SATA power for like a hard drive or SATA SSD. Anyways, locate those power cables and just plug in the CPU power cable into the top left of the motherboard power cable into the middle right of the motherboard, and then go ahead and take your PCIe power cables and plug them into the graphics card, and you are done. And finally, for the PC case, I'm gonna let you guys choose whatever micro ATX or ATX case you want. And if you want a list of my recommended micro ATX or bigger PC cases, I will have a link to that in the description below, where I discuss a bunch of PC case alternatives. Now for this build guide, I did go ahead and use the Cougar Gemini S, which is an ATX mid tower. I'd actually recommend the Gemini M because that's a micro ATX tower. And I mean, that's more appropriate for a micro ATX motherboard. But regardless, if you want this case, I will have it linked in the description, but you don't have to go with this exact case. But no matter what case you choose, the front IO is going to be about the same. We're going to have to plug in the USB 3.0, USB 2.0, power switch, power LED, and HD audio. Yeah, all those front IO cables into the motherboard. That won't change no matter what case you go with. And to install those and where to plug them in onto the motherboard is really easy. Just refer to your motherboard manual where you can find the different locations of where each of those cables go in, and just go ahead, put them in one by one. It's just like building Legos. You just got to find where it is in the manual and plug it in. But all of it should be pretty visual, so it shouldn't be that hard to do. And once you have all of those components hooked up, that should be about $1,000, and you should be set for your gaming PC as far as booting up, as long as you have an installable version of Windows 10 on a handy USB flash drive, which you got to plug in first before you turn on the computer if you want to install Windows, which, by the way, I have another video guide here for that, as well as linked in the description. So once you've built up everything, here are a few final things I would do to install the drivers and just make sure that your gaming PC is all ready to go. So first up, make sure you enable the XMP profile for your RAM and the BIOS, which is really easy. Just as soon as you start the PC, spam the delete key on your motherboard, and then you should go to the BIOS and then find where the memory is and just change from like default to profile 1 on the XMP profile setting. And this will be pretty much the same across any motherboard that you get. Now to install your graphics card drivers, it's really easy. Just go to Google Chrome, type in NVIDIA drivers, go to the nvidia.com link, and then search the driver for the RTX 2060 Super. It should be the first one. Click download, express installation, and you're done. And now for your chipset drivers, go into Google again, type in B550 chipset drivers, go to the AMD link, and then click download, and then run that. And now you've installed your B550 chipset drivers. But now if you want to install any miscellaneous motherboard utilities like the MSI Mystic Light RGB utility here, where you can change the different RGB lights in your PC. You can just search up your motherboard on Google and then go to drivers and support, and you can find the different utilities for your motherboard that you've chosen and download which ones you want. All of those are necessary. The only necessary ones I would get, again, are the graphics card drivers and the chipset drivers. But besides that, you should be basically good to go for gaming on your new PC, because then you can go like and install Steam, Chrome, Epic Games Launcher, Origin Launcher, whatever you want. You're basically ready to go. And now we've arrived to the benchmark section. And this part is where a lot of the games I tested are actually at 1440p. So the actual resolution is higher and harder to push a higher frame rate to. So if you see a high frame rate in one of these benchmarks, then I guarantee you when that is ran at 1080p, the game frame rate is going to be considerably higher. So just keep that in mind. Both all that said, here are the benchmarks with this PC at stock with no overclocking. Going a little wide right there. Yup. Have to do a torpedo maneuver. Not quite, actually. Metal! So those were the benchmarks, and now let's get into my final pros and cons on this $1,000 gaming PC. So really, I have no cons, because this gaming PC should do everything you'd want because it is $1,000. It's not a super tight budget PC, so there aren't really any limitations that I see, possibly besides the storage, because there is 500 gigabytes of storage on this M.2 drive. It could be bigger because, again, if you are going to install Call of Duty Warzone, Fortnite, and like Ark Survival, if you're that sort of person, that's going to take up at least 450 gigabytes on your system drive. So storage is the only thing I could see possibly being a problem on this PC. But again, you can choose a bigger M.2 SSD like the 1TB MX500 or above. Or you can just start off with the 500 gigabyte and then add on like a miscellaneous hard drive or SATA SSD later down the road, which you can hook up with the SATA connectors on the motherboard. But besides that, as you can see, it can stream. It can game at 1440p surprisingly well, and of course game at 1080p super well. And honestly, this is quite overkill for 1080p unless you want to get like a 240 frame per second experience on like a 240 hertz monitor if you're one of those people. But really, I think this PC is super overkill for 1080p and more than enough, or just enough, for 1440p 2K resolution gaming. And finally, again, this PC is using a B550 motherboard, so it is primed for any sort of 4th gen Ryzen upgrades if you want to move on from the 3300X in this build. Anyways, that is it for my $1,000 gaming PC build guide. And again, if you enjoy these, most definitely subscribe to the Scattervault channel because I have some more build guides on the way that are going to be formulated and tested just like this. So if you like what you see, you might as well subscribe. I know I kind of did reverse psychology at the start of the video, but that's just a little trick in my sleeve I wanted to try for this video. I've also got 5 different flavors of social media you can interact with, that being Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, which may or may not be existing like 1 month from now because the US might take it down, but it's there just in case. But I've got all that in the description below if you want to become more involved with the Scattervault community. And finally, with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and this is the Scattervault channel.